It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you who were at the Cross Watershed Network workshop in Escalante back in October, the first half of this presentation may look pretty familiar. We were invited to talk about restoration strategies for enhancing ecosystem resilience at the Cross Watershed Network workshop, and then there was the idea with talking with the Tamarack Coalition. It seemed like it made sense to repeat it and try to revise the presentation for the session today, and as a lead-in to the rest of the landscape planning session, where we'll be talking about LCCs, the Cross Watershed Network, and the Tamarack leaf beetle, which fits into this story as well. And I should point out my co-authors, Chris Rasmussen from Eco Mainstream Contracting, worked with me on this talk as well as on the Cross Watershed Network. And then my colleague, our senior riparian ecologist at Stillwater Sciences, Amy Merrill, is also one of our co-authors. So first off, what is ecological resilience? I'll go through some quick definitions and give you some background so we're all talking from common language. The concept's been around for about 50 years in the theoretical ecology literature, but it's only in the last 10, 15 years that's popped up more in the restoration ecology literature, and it's become more of an issue for restoration practitioners, which is why the practitioners had asked that the topic be covered at the Cross Watershed Network. After the basic definitions, I'll go into how do human actions threaten ecosystem resilience? Why does it matter? What should we be thinking about when we're designing restoration and trying to understand the watersheds and landscapes we're working in and the influence of human actions? And then try to wrap up with some limited number of case studies on how do we incorporate resilient strategies into our restoration projects. This is a big topic. In some ways, the concept of ecosystem resilience is repackaging or rebranding of basic concepts of watershed analysis, watershed management, ecosystem management. So if you've been in the field for quite a while, a lot of this may seem familiar, but I think it's an interesting tool for shifting our thinking as we look into the future. Rather than going back to the retrospective analysis of historical reference conditions, we use the historical context and present context to better understand how our systems operate, and that gives us improved understanding to then make those projections of what type of trajectories are our systems on without management intervention, and where might we direct them with appropriate management intervention. Okay, as I mentioned, the concept of ecosystem resilience has been around for quite a while. There are a lot of different definitions and nuances out there in the literature, as well as a lot of related terms. Since we only have 20, 25 minutes today, I'm doing a very quick overview. So hang on to your hats and your coffee cups, and we'll just zip through this pretty quickly. For our purposes, and I think for restoration practitioners in general, these two definitions that I found work quite well. Pretty basic concept. Ecosystem resilience is the ability of ecological systems to persist despite changing conditions. And resilience is measured by the amount of disturbance a system can absorb without shifting to an alternative state. So to help us get into that better understanding of that concept, here's a classic ball and cup model of ecological resilience. If you've worked in rangeland management and dealt with state transition modeling or looked in the ecological literature, this will be familiar. The idea is the cups represent sort of attraction basins into which the ball representing the ecosystem is drawn. And if the attraction basin is small, like in this example, the size and shape of that basin affects the amount of resilience your system has. So if the cup is small, you have relatively limited resilience, and then a disturbance may shift you over a threshold into a different state. In this case, we have threshold is that point at which a small change in environmental conditions and associated with some type of disturbance can lead to a shift in the state of your system. And that new state may be more desirable if you're passing a threshold due to your restoration actions and improving the ecosystem functions, or in many cases, it's pushing you into a more degraded, less desirable state. So a couple concepts that are important as we think about this is the idea of helpful resilience. So if you're up here in this desired state, then what you want to do is manage to help enhance and promote that helpful resilience and keep the ecosystem in that desired healthy ecosystem state. But if you're down here in an undesirable degraded state, then you're dealing with any resilience there is really tending to keep that ecosystem in that degraded condition. So the term that's been used to describe that is unhelpful resilience. So pretty simple terminology and concepts. but I think it's quite helpful when you start looking into your restoration and management planning. Are you in a state where you really want to be focusing on helpful resilience, or do you need to overcome unhelpful resilience? So just to help clarify, here's another expanded ball and cup diagram. Once again, up in this upper left-hand corner, the ecosystem is in a fairly desirable state. So that's sort of the healthiest, most desirable state right up there. This next state over still may have some altered species composition, but it still maintains sort of the full suite of ecosystem functions that you want in your system. And contrast that with this degraded state where you've lost most of the ecosystem attributes or functions that you want, and species composition is in all likelihood dramatically different from that desirable state. So next, I think one of the key concepts here is how do human actions alter those thresholds, and maybe different types of human actions can lead us to change the bar or how high that threshold is set, and that then may facilitate or promote transition into an undesirable state. So on the, just to go over this slide briefly, so over here on the left-hand side, we have an ecosystem in the desirable state with valuable ecosystem services, and as we move across to the right, we're getting into loss of those services in an undesirable state. Down at the bottom are just two examples from the literature. These concepts are best demonstrated by case studies in aquatic systems, not in rivers though, not river riparian yet, that's something I'd like to get into, and our co-authors would definitely like to develop further. And then in grassland ecosystems. So in this case, start with the desirable state, and then due to some human action, overfishing or coastal eutrophication or ocean acidification in the coral reef system or fire prevention in a grassland system, you start shifting the height of that threshold condition. That then makes the system more susceptible to further alterations in thresholds and shifts due to other associated disturbances. And ultimately, changing that threshold state makes it much easier for the system, the ecosystem, to drop into that undesirable state. Now I'd like to quickly shift into some of our case studies. And we're focusing on examples from the Upper Colorado Basin. The first one I'll be talking about is the Upper Dolores watershed. And then I'll get to it later, but I have another example from the Lower Virgin River down in the lower watershed. And then a third example that I won't go into any detail, but I'll tell you where to look if you're interested in it. So here's a close-up view of the Upper Dolores watershed. It's the watershed above McPhee Reservoir. Here's the town of Dolores. This is in the sort of the southwest corner of Colorado. If you know where Durango is, there's a point of reference. This project is one that's currently underway by Trout Unlimited, and my co-author Chris is the one that's most involved in this project. And if you have questions, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer them later. So the key thrust of the project is Trout Unlimited is very interested in obviously restoring, maintaining, and conserving and restoring trout populations, in particular the native Colorado cutthroat trout in the Upper Dolores watershed, as well as other sport fish of interest to Trout Unlimited. And they want to do this in the context of climate change. So common dilemma, we have limited time and resources for restoration and conservation. How do we set up priorities? And to help set those priorities, we really need to understand how the landscape in the watershed operates. So what you want to do is, once again, it's basic, watershed analysis, looking at what are the larger factors driving your system: climate, topography, geology. How does that influence then hydrology and fluvial geomorphic processes and other ecological processes in your watershed? How do those processes in turn affect habitat conditions, and how do habitat conditions then affect the species and populations of interest that those habitat conditions then drive the biotic response of the trout populations? So another key, after you sort of have that general conceptual model of the linkages and how your watershed works, the next step is to look at current stressors and threats, and in this context really focusing on what are new threats that are going to be increasing with climate change. So in this case, this slide is showing predicted hydroclimate changes. So basically, as temperature changes, we'll see a shift in the predominance of snow versus rain in terms of what's the predominant precipitation pattern. That will vary geographically, both over large regions as well as within a watershed. And I won't go into great detail, but basically the green is showing that the upper part of the watershed here is generally staying in a snow-dominated system, which means you'll have, slower, steady runoff from the snowpack, unless you're in a drought year. And then as you move down into the lower elevations, you start getting into regions that are probably going to convert from snow to more of a transient condition. And then as you get down to the lowest elevations, complete conversion from snow-dominated to rain-dominated system. So how does that matter to the fish? Well, it definitely affects the risk to spawning success. So changing hydroclimate can increase the risk of large flashy floods and change the timing of flood events. And that, depending on the timing and the intensity of those flows, you may wash out trout reds. So basically wipe out the eggs in incubating fry. And just for another point of context, the blue polygons here outline the general current distribution of the native cutthroat trout in the upper basin. Next slide. Here's the threat of increasing risk of drought, common problem with popping up in predictions with climate change. So one of the things that increased risk of drought will lead to reduced flows in the headwaters in those drought years. That may mean that the headward extent of your channel may be going down slope. You'll need more drainage area, more accumulation of water before you actually initiate a perennial channel. So you'll be shrinking some of the potential trout habitat from the headwaters on down, so essentially drying from the top. And with that will be an associated risk of reduction in suitable habitat. Next, here's another layer from the climate models and fire modeling at regional scale overlaid on the Dolores River watershed, looking at the increasing risk of increasing frequency of fire. And not too surprising, in this case, the lower elevations will have increased temperatures, lower precipitation, conditions that generally will promote increased frequency of fire ignitions. So basically, you've got that potential drought causing drying from the top combined with this threat of increased fire frequency from the bottom, once again restricting that likely range of suitable habitat for your native cutthroat trout and for other cold water fishes in the system. And that, of course, is potentially reducing the amount of habitat, reducing connectivity between different subwatersheds and tributaries will increase the risk of extirpation of local populations. And contrast that last slide with this one. This is related to fire again, but in this case, it's the increased probability of stand replacing fires. And so in this case, you'll see that the higher probabilities are up in the upper watershed. So in this case, the frequency of fire ignitions may be lower as that in the upper areas, as the prior slide showed. But due to climate change conditions and forest conditions, we're going to have increased fuel loads, increased risk of forest tree mortality due to bark beetle populations, increasing the likelihood of when you do have a fire, it's going to be a huge catastrophic fire, stand replacement fire, which then has associated risk of increasing the amount of sediment and other impacts to the stream system, causing a higher risk of associated habitat damage. And once again, if you get these catastrophic events in some of your key watersheds supporting the native cutthroat trouts, if it's too severe, you have a risk of you're following a fire really wiping out. If you had, say, a big episodic flood year after a fire, you could completely wipe out the population in some of these subbasins. So once again, reducing the metapopulation size of the cutthroat trout in the upper Dolores watershed and increasing the risk ultimately of extirpation. So just to wrap this up, those are some of just a brief glimpse of some of the different data layers and the approaches that are going into this Trout Unlimited project to try to develop better strategies for coping with climate change and allowing them to prioritize and decide where to focus their resources. The project is underway. We don't really know what it means yet. So the big question mark is, what are the chances for promoting long-term sustainable populations of cutthroat trout in the basin? And that's a question that remains to be answered. The next case study, I'll shift to the lower Colorado Basin here, and here's the Virgin River. This is part of a multi-year, multi-phase study that we've talked about the last two Tamarask Coalition conferences. So if you're interested in the broader context and the details, I suggest you go back online and check some of those talks or talk to me or my colleague Glenn Leverich, and we'd be happy to provide more details. So the initial study was a sort of first phase, full river corridor planning, coarse brush approach to decide where would efforts best be focused for active restoration, as well as areas that might be more suitable and strategies to promote more passive restoration and native revegetation process. So this was a 120-mile river corridor from Zion National Park down to Lake Mead. For the rest of the case study today, I'll be focusing just down in the Mormon Mesa Reach, just above Lake Mead in the lower river in Nevada. And this area is of key interest because it's the first area where the introduced Tamarask leaf beetle that was introduced for biological control moved into a watershed that supported critical habitat for the endangered southwestern willow flycatcher. So once again, if you've been at prior conferences, you've heard a lot about this basic story. Here's the southwestern willow flycatcher, here's the Tamarask leaf beetle. And then soon after the beetle was introduced in the upper part of the watershed, the populations grew, they started moving down, and you could just track this migration front of the beetles as they moved from the upper Virgin River down into the lower Virgin River. And this is a shot taken right near the Arizona-Nevada border, near Littlefield. And Tom Dudley at UC Santa Barbara, one of our collaborators, took these photos. In June of 2010, the beetle front really had not actively moved into the system. You can still see this dense green, lush tamarask foliage in the floodplain. Just 30 days later, the beetles had moved into the system and it caused extensive defoliation. Basically, all that brown is tamarask, and you can just see there are a few little patchy native cottonwoods, willows, and mesquites that are still in the system. But one of the challenges in the lower Virgin River in particular is that it's almost a complete monoculture of tamarask. So we have very few native cottonwoods and willows left in the system. And so as the beetle comes in and does its thing, it's having a huge impact on the southwestern willow flycatcher. As we move down into the Mormon Mesa Reach, in the particular case study I want to focus on right now, this is a project that arose out of that earlier sort of river corridor scale project, and looking at the historical high quality habitat for the southwestern willow flycatcher, and as well as the potential for restoration. This area came up as probably the highest restoration potential for the whole area. It's historically been the stronghold of southwestern willow flycatcher populations in the lower river. And this shot was taken in September of 2013. Looking out across the floodplain, you can see at this point the beetle has clearly moved in the system. You got this huge matrix of defoliated tamarask. Then out in the middle is this node of existing the high quality flycatcher habitat. Of course, habitat quality is now changing with defoliation of tamarask. That's another story. But you can see this dark green. Those are emergent canopies of Gooding's willow, Salix goodingii, that are emerging above the defoliated tamarask. And the goal here was, as part of Clark County's desert conservation program, they had an 80-acre site they wanted to use that, as I said, was sort of the highest priority restoration potential from our prior analysis. And the idea was to enhance and expand that existing habitat node to promote better habitat for the southwestern willow flycatcher and other associated riparian bird species, and a broader goal of just increasing biodiversity in the whole area. So how do we do that? Well, here's an aerial photo taken just before the extensive tamarask defoliation occurred. So all this dark green is a dense matrix of undefoliated tamarask. And so what you can't see too well on this photo then is the emergent canopies of Gooding's willow. And this vegetation unit 5 here is sort of the downstream edge of that existing habitat node for southwestern willow flycatcher. And as part of our planning process, we did reach scale evaluations to put the site in context, understand the risk of flood scour, flood resetting during the next big flood, understand surface and soil, groundwater patterns and depth of groundwater, surface flow patterns, soil texture and salinity. All those factors were part of the assessment. And as a result of that assessment, we decided that what we wanted to do was to do these sort of small-scale patch removals of tamarisk and replanting with native vegetation, in this case with Gooding's willows, as well as coyote willow, Salix exigua, and Fremont cottonwood in the initial planting phase, in these different patches where we would sort of put a patch right along the edge of this existing high-quality habitat, historically high-quality flycatcher habitat patch, and then clear these patches and try to expand that node then over time. We also wanted to take advantage of this chunk of the site that was carved out in a December 2010 flood, and that's what we're calling our natural recruitment zone. It was naturally recolonized by a lot of screwbee mesquite, arrowweed, and a variety of other plants, and it has potential for conditions, especially in those areas G and H, to plant the willows and cottonwoods as well there and try to create new flycatcher habitat. So that could be another part of expanding this general node. And here's just a couple slides to show you what the site looked like. Here's one of the bigger patches where you can see this dense matrix of defoliated tamarisk. It was cleared here by Great Basin Institute with their Youth Conservation Corps crew. So this is all manual removal and herbiciding. The removed tamarisk was put around the edge of there to create a wall of tamarisk 10 to 12 feet high. And that was in part done to reduce the risk of trespass cattle getting into the site and reduce the amount of fencing they were going to have to install. This view is looking upstream. You can see these emergent canopies of Gooding's willow in the adjacent habitat node, the flycatcher habitat node. We're just that close to it. And then within the site, we had a few existing Gooding's willows that were retained to maintain the habitat structure and a potential seed source for natural recruitment. But the next step was we also did other patches. And one of the things, since this was focused initially on expanding the southwestern willow flycatcher habitat node, one of the critical elements was looking for surface water conditions. And this was a shot taken in February of 2014. And you could actually see a lot of the sites had small little streams running through the site that had up to 1 cubic feet per second of water actually flowing through the site. And that was pretty consistent throughout the year. So that was a really critical feature to zero in on for creating higher quality flycatcher habitat. And here's a similar site that had that dense network of stream channels at the surface. We had high success of Gooding's and coyote willow, as well as some cottonwood success replanting here. We also had a lot of natural recruitment of Pluchia odorata, a native herbaceous plant that had a great seed bed in the area. So it was nice. If you looked at that dense tamarisk monoculture that's still out there, even though it's defoliated, you see very little native plant diversity. But the plants are there in patches and the seed sources are there. So if we open it up, we have a chance of getting those in there, as well as this whole effort is planned to be a phased planting. So this next year, they'll be going back in, putting more cottonwoods and willows as needed. We're also doing some experimental ash plantings, trying to see what else might grow in this area. And then a lot of the understory shrubs and herbaceous components will be added in as necessary to enhance biodiversity. And here's just a quick shot of that other node, the natural recruitment area. And right here is an area, a back channel that was created during that December 2010 flood that still maintains surface water and moisture throughout much of the year. It's adjacent to the tamarisk. So this is an area that we're looking at sort of experimental plantings to see if we can also create flycatcher habitat in this area as well as just coming in and controlling camel thorn, which is recruited very heavily in this area, is sort of a secondary invasive weed problem in this site. So I've got 1 or 2 minutes left, but the last concept I just wanted to mention is, so as previously I was talking about this expansion of existing habitat nodes, and we're doing that, I focus on the site scale, but we're also doing that throughout the river corridor analysis. So the idea is we identify areas that have existing vegetation and suitable habitat. We target those for the prioritized active horticultural restoration to expand the habitat node. But as a next step, we want to then look, how are those habitat node sites distributed throughout the river corridor? As I mentioned, in this system, with the heavy dominance of tamarisk in the system, we have a limited number of source trees of mature cottonwoods and willows. So unlike most river systems I've worked in, where each individual cottonwood and willow tree can produce 1 million seeds per year, you generally don't have a problem with seed limitation and seed dispersal But in this system, it is a big issue. We did some detailed mapping with some of our collaborators, and there's some long reaches that really are depopulate of source trees. So if we don't have an identified habitat node to expand in there, we also wanted to come in and implement this concept of creating propagule islands in those areas that might be really shy of mature cottonwoods and willows. So we want to have a good source of seeds there for the next big flood. This system still has relatively unregulated hydrology. So as the tamarisk mortality increases with defoliation from the tamarisk leaf beetle, we want to make sure we have a good source of native seeds of all the variety of native riparian plant species we want to get reestablished and help promote natural revegetation that way, and also in the process, hopefully reduce the risk of secondary invaders taking over as well. And then just the third example that I won't go into is on the upper Gila River. We're currently engaged with the Gila Watershed Partnership on that project. Funding has been provided by the Walton Foundation, which also provided most of the funding for the initial phase of the Virgin River work. And if you're interested in this, talk to me or Glenn later, or look at Glenn's poster out there and catch his talk this afternoon for more information on where that project is and where we are and how restoration planning fits into the permitting issues. And with that, I think I should probably end up in the interest of time, but I just wanted to wrap up on this slide. This is just a summary slide from a nice paper by Stein et al. In 2013. And if you're interested in any of the papers that have been cited, drop me an email and I'd be happy to send you the papers or at least the reference. So, what actions can we take to improve current conditions, reducing, non-climate related threats? We know we have this overarching threat of climate change. What are the other stressors and threats in the system, and can we get a better handle on those? This whole conference, we're talking about restoring floodplains, not necessarily removing dams, but that's an option in cases where the dams are obsolete, but also restoring more of a natural fire regime. And I won't go into the rest of these examples, but you can see there's a whole range of different levels of strategies and then different types of actions you might take to enhance ecological resilience. And with that, I'll stop, and I think we have time for one or two questions. No? One question? All right, thanks. I'll be around the rest of the day and tomorrow too.